concept of a first-person shooter on a handheld was something that was never truly realised until the release of Ecks vs Sever on the GBA that more than proved that the otherwise dedicated 2D handheld was more than up to the challenge of creating a 3D experience that could be taken with you on the go. Coming from the absolute wizards at Crawfish, the same team responsible for the incredible port of Street Fighter Alpha 3, they faced the challenge head-on and crafted what is perhaps one of the handheld's most impressive games. It follows an FBI agent and a trained assassin, which you get to choose from at the beginning before you're thrown into a series of levels that naturally increase in difficulty the further you get in. Helping along the way is the extensive amount of weapons, from simple handguns to machine guns and grenades, that help even the odds against the enemies that lurk around each corner. What really soon becomes one of the game's strongest aspects though is its presentation, and the 3D engine that allowed the team to craft a pretty extensive first-person shooter that felt miles beyond anything that was possible at the time. Sure, there's some drawbacks with both the ceiling and floors remaining untextured, but the engine allowed for a huge range of different structures to be built within each level, such as multi-floored buildings as well as staircases, windows to climb in and out of, and raised platforms that provided a real sense of verticality to the action. Running at a pretty consistent speed and factoring in the lack of inputs on the handheld, the controls run surprisingly smooth, allowing you to strafe or completely turn around, making the combat quite impactful. Ecks vs Sever was a welcome surprise to the many players that simply wrote off the GBA's 3D abilities and ended up being an excellent game in its own right. The isometric Tony Hawk games were amongst some of the most enjoyable titles on the GBA that perfectly translated the gameplay the series was known and loved for to the small screen. Although not as popular and widely celebrated, Downhill Jam broke the cycle and dared to try something different, something that would push the system to its absolute limits and leave behind the isometric nature of the earlier games and instead opt for a fully 3D take in the palm of your hands. Developed by Visual Impact, the team responsible for another impressive port of SSX, Downhill Jam was the first time the behind-the-player camera was implemented and saw you having to take on a series of downhill runs as you race to the finish and try to score as many points as you can. As you can see, the graphics are extremely simple, with polygons being used with different shades to replicate each environment that came along with a decent amount of variety. There's about 7 different levels to make your way through, from the city streets of San Francisco to the outback desert and icy slopes that all look pretty well realised, considering the drawbacks of the 3D engine. As you descend each slope, the scenery slowly draws into view, and while the frame rate can be a bit choppy, it's nothing that detracts from the gameplay. If there was one downfall to the game though, it's just how cheap your AI opponents feel, as they have a tendency to defy the game's own logic and have a severe case of rubber banding that prevents you from getting too far ahead. With that being said though, on a technical level, Downhill Jam is quite the feat on the Game Boy Advance, regardless of some of the issues with its gameplay. Sure, the DS version is far superior, but credit where credit is due, and Visual Impact pulled off the impossible, more than proving that the system could hold its own when it came to 3D. Stuntman was yet another impressive 3D release for the Game Boy Advance, as you take on a range of different levels and perform stunts in order to complete a movie. The stunts in the Game Boy Advance version aren't exactly mind-boggling and amount to nothing more than having to drive around cars, make sharp turns, drive off jumps and slip through tight spaces, but what helps make it all feel so enjoyable is the engine that the game's built on, which manages to deliver on that feeling of defying the odds. Originally appearing on the PlayStation 2, it seemed like a bit of a joke at first that it would be heading to the GBA, but it made the transition quite nicely. The visuals are certainly not on par with the original, but when compared to the many other racing games on the handheld, it's a real standout. Each of the courses are presented in full 3D, with them all being filled with buildings, roads and other vehicles and objects to avoid, made possible through the expert use of texture maps and polygons, the likes of which you'd often see in early PlayStation games. As with many 3D ports to the GBA, there's a series of trade-offs, and the physics engine was one that was never going to be able to make the jump to the handheld, but a decent attempt was made to make it seem believable. Each car gets an impressive amount of detail with nice little touches, such as dust raising from the ground as you drift around a corner, and plenty of diversity in each course's setup, with a ton of raised roads, tight turns and huge drops that your car reacts to in a realistic way. The gameplay itself hits home quite well, with the handling of each car being a breeze, allowing you to hit each jump or turn with confidence, and with such a huge variety of vehicles and scenarios to earn and complete, there's a nice amount of content to keep you busy as well. After the somewhat laughable attempt of bringing the series to the GBA with MK Advance, the last thing on many people's minds was another Mortal Kombat game for the system. The news of Deadly Alliance coming to the handheld was met with low expectations, but when the screenshots started to drop, many couldn't believe what they were seeing, as the port decided to completely drop its reliance on 2D and instead present itself as one of the only 3D fighters on the system. We're not talking about 3D in the way Tekken Advance claimed to be as well. This was true 3D, allowing you to sidestep around enemies and watch as the camera slowly rotates and zooms in and out with your movements. Obviously, a few concessions were made in order to get it up and running, and the fighters don't have the same sort of attention to detail like the backgrounds have in each stage, with them feeling sort of pasted onto the action. But with just how smoothly they animate and each and every one of their moves look and feel, it's something that can easily be overlooked. As with many games in the series, every punch, kick or slice of your sword comes along with a satisfying amount of gore that's sent flying across the screen with every hit, as well as a healthy selection of fatalities making the cut, which as you would guess look pretty awesome to perform. Of course, all of this eye candy would mean nothing if it didn't play well, and this is where Deadly Alliance truly proves its dominance over many of the other fighting games on the system. The full console experience is here, with a huge roster of characters that possess a wide array of combos, as well as the selection of 2 different fighting styles for each fighter, allowing you to switch up your approach on the fly. Sure, it's not quite as deep as the likes of Street Fighter Alpha 3, but seeing nearly every aspect of its home console counterpart here in the palm of your hands was something to be truly commended. Flight of the Falcon is an often overlooked and forgotten Star Wars game on the GBA, and there's a good reason why, as it was an absolute shitstorm that played nowhere near as well as it looked. At first, its premise seems pretty promising, with you having to jump into one of the many different ships from the series as you take on a range of missions pulled straight from one of the first 3 films. On a positive note, the visuals are what really steal the show, and the various locations from Bespin to Endor and Tatooine are all instantly recognisable, as well as being nicely detailed, which can also be said for one of the many ships. When it comes to gameplay, the game runs quite smoothly and manages to come along with a decent sense of speed, but only for some of the levels, mainly the ones that take place in space, where there's not that much to draw and instead a lot more focus can be put on the action. But as you can see here, when you're in a populated level, such as a town or city, the visuals fly by in a somewhat staggered state, making it feel like a jumbled mess at points, but like I said, when you're in space it's a lot more pleasing on the eyes, with your X-Wing or the Millennium Falcon animating quite well as you dodge incoming fire and try to down one of the many different targets that come your way. It's basically an on-rail shooter, with the objective of each level being rather simple, such as having to reach the end before the timer runs out or having to destroy a certain amount of enemies to succeed. The problem is that the control of each ship is horrendous, and with the small screen a lot of the enemies get lost in the background, and to make matters worse you're only able to shoot within a small window, leaving a lot of fighters on the edge of the screen that you're unable to reach, but they can still fire at you, making it rather unfair. When all is said and done, Flight of the Falcon is no doubt quite an impressive feat on the console, but the absolute state of its gameplay makes it nothing more than a showcase as to what the system was capable of in terms of 3D. The Game Boy Advance was a great system to own when it came to having a good selection of races to take with you on the go, with the likes of Mario Kart and F-Zero coming from Nintendo and plenty of third-party options. You were never short on choice when it came to getting your racing fix. In terms of visuals though, one game that not many people even consider is Lego Dome Racers. That is by far one of the most technically impressive games that landed on the console. Right from the outset, it's easy to compare it to Sega's Virtua Racing, with the game using bold colours and shaded polygons to create a fully realised 3D setup. To begin with, the cars themselves are made of polygons as well, which means that you can see the cars rotate as they turn and grow larger and smaller as they move closer to and further away from the camera. The 3D engine also benefits the tracks themselves, with plenty of hills and sharp drops that serve to mix up the gameplay, with each of the tracks possessing a nice amount of detail, with plenty of little touches such as trees, stands for the crowds and patches of ice or dirt that lay out across the road. What really blew me away though is that even with up to 8 different races on the screen and the huge location it's got to render, the action never gets interrupted by bouts of frame drop, and considering the limitations of the hardware and just how fast the game runs, it's incredible how they even achieved it in the first place. In terms of gameplay, the racing itself is pretty tight as well, making not only for a great looking game on the small screen, but one that plays just as good as it looks, with an arcade approach to its driving as well as an emphasis upon the use of items and weapons that make each race extremely fun to work through. To be fair, the LEGO branding obviously didn't do it no favours, and likely saw many simply ignore this absolute gem of a game that deserved way more attention when it first released. Crazy Taxi was a huge hit on the Dreamcast, and with the console's eventual demise, it started to find its way to the other systems with releases on the PS2 and of course the GBA. Now let's get the bad out of the way first. This port isn't exactly the best version of the game, and as you can see, it's the frame rate that really lets it down. But on a technical level and just how ambitious this project was, it's still something that's worth praising. Catch a Ride came along with the 2 complete cities from the original version, built from the ground up for the new 3D engine that gave you the freedom to drive around and pick up customers at your own pace. These weren't no simple renditions either, with both of the cities being complete with texture map buildings and objects, as well as the roads being occupied with oncoming traffic, to make the simple act of dropping people off in time all the more challenging. To top this off, your car was a 2D sprite, but it was drawn at several different angles to give it the illusion of a 3D object to great effect. It reacted believably depending on the terrain you were driving on, may that be climbing one of the many steep hills or drifting around a corner, that gave it a real weight and went a really long way in helping you ground yourself in the world. Like I mentioned though, the hardware just wasn't up to the challenge, and unfortunately it could barely keep up with what the game was demanding of it. In most cases it was playable, but in one of the more populated areas of the city with loads of traffic and different textured surfaces, it could hit as low as 5 frames per second, and that was anything but ideal. It was clear that the developers were fans of the series and came up with something that was close as possible to the original, so if you can look past the frame rate issues, it's still pretty fun to play, but just don't go in expecting the full-on Crazy Taxi experience. The Game Boy Advance received its fair share of first-person shooters, with both Doom and Wolfenstein making an appearance on the console. Dark Arena was one that truly impressed, and even though it was the first of its kind to be announced for the system, it ended up releasing far later than intended, which gave the developers a bit more time to refine its formula and create one of the best in its class. Now the game's setup is quite predictable and nothing to write home about, with it seeing you take on the fight as a soldier who's been trapped within a genetic lab with all of the unimaginable monstrosities breaking loose, and it's up to you to blast your way out and neutralize the threat they pose. It plays a lot like Doom, with just over 20 levels to complete, but what helps the game become so enjoyable is just how well the game runs and the sheer speed in which the action plays out. At any one time, there can be a multitude of enemies on screen, with each of the levels being well designed, with plenty of complexity such as angled rooms and corridors to navigate, and even though with the likes of Ecks vs Server, with no texture mapping on floors or the ceiling, the developers of Dark Arena successfully found a workaround by adding a divot mesh over each surface that lends each level a bit more detail. Now the frame rate can become a bit of an issue though, especially when the gunplay ramps up and there's more than 2 enemies on screen. That can have a tendency to take you out of it, but it's nothing that makes the game unplayable. But if there was one major issue that I could throw against the game, it would be that it overall feels quite bland in terms of style compared to the other shooters on the system. It just feels rather generic, but the technical nature of its maker is what makes it a real standout in the console's library that tried to create something original and ambitious within the confines of the limited hardware. V-Rally 3 is amongst some of the most impressive games on the GBA when it comes to 3D. That was developed in-house by the same team responsible for some of the better looking games on the Game Boy Color like Wacky Racers and V-Rally 2. With the more powerful hardware, the team pulled out all of the stops and managed to produce something nearly on par with an early PS1 game, with each of the locations being realised in complete real 3D and an abundance of textured surfaces, allowing them to become really creative with each of the course's designs, with a range of different turns, sloping hills and jumps, to cliffs, tunnels and bridges, which all become a part of one of the 7 different tracks in the game. A few cutbacks were implemented though, no doubt in order to keep the game running at a respectable speed, and this is mainly the cars, and the various background elements and scenery that were handled with the use of sprites, drawn in different states to emulate a solid object. The result is uncanny, and seeing it in motion whilst keeping the limitations of the system in the back of your mind is absolutely incredible, even to this day. Going hand in hand with the visuals are the somewhat primitive but completely serviceable physics system that allowed the car to behave believably, with each and every one of the vehicles handling well and having a real weight to them, with the different types of terrain, may that be dirt, asphalt or snow, reacting in different ways and pushing you to compensate with your skill. Just like most races, there's a nice amount of modes on offer as well, with the Championship or V-Rally mode being the main meal of the game. Here you get to sign up with one of several real-life car makers from Renault to Subaru and Ford, where you're free to make modifications to your car depending on the track, such as your suspension, brakes and gearbox that have a noticeable difference on the road. Ultimately, with its incredible graphics, convincing gameplay and decent amount of challenge, V-Rally 3 is the gold standard when it comes to racing games on the handheld. The first Ecks vs server took everyone by surprise, and at the time only had Doom and Backtrack to contend with, and completely blew them out of the water. As the years passed, several improvements and other first-person shooters on the GBA started to appear, such as Duke Nukem and Serious Sam, that all but knocked Ecks vs server off its pedestal. But with its sequel, it would once again prove that it was the king of the handheld FPS. Unlike the other games, it's not a simple runner and shooter that sees you having to blast everything in sight, but instead a more slow and methodical tactical shooter that demands you explore each level and take full advantage of your arsenal of weapons as each situation presents itself. This is where the game comes into its own, and depending on which of the 2 characters you choose at the beginning, you'll be playing through vastly different scenarios, with up to nearly 25 missions to complete. Now when it comes to the game's presentation, the defining feature of the first game, the sequel upped the ante and uses an enhanced version of Crawfish's raycasting engine with a whole list of different improvements. May that be the higher resolution textures, more detailed weapons, a huge increase to the variety of level design, and the amount of frames of animation given not only to the enemies but all of your actions within the game as well. Simply put, it looks stunning on the small screen, and for 90% of the time it's a pretty smooth affair, with the speed only dropping when there's a huge amount of enemies on the screen at once. Thankfully, these moments are few and far between, allowing you to enjoy the slow-paced tactical approach the game takes with its gameplay. Even though it's not without its issues, for me Ecks vs Server 2 offers one of the finest examples of a 3D game done right on the GBA, so if you're looking for something to go back to and enjoy on the system, definitely consider giving this one a go. Well, that's another video in the books. Keep an eye out for part 2 as that will be coming up soon, so don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified about new videos that release every Monday and Thursday. You can follow me on all of the socials which are linked below to stay up to date, and also join my growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters: Rhino, Skilljim, Shuden, Richard, Amy, Daniel, Dio, Omar, Ophinium Mind, Strider, Pierre, Carl, Awesome Jacket Dude, Maximus, Scott, Alfred, Terry, Ryan, Alex, GameCube Galaxy, Curse Salaryman, Fake and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining my Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon, you'll find all of these links down below. As always, thanks for taking the time to check the video out. I'll catch you next time.